Hello, good evening, and welcome to this In Conversation With event. My guest tonight is Paul Krugman, one of the most distinguished economists of the post-war period and winner of the Nobel Prize in 2008. Known around the world for his trenchant views on economics and politics, and of course for his immensely successful column in the New York Times, Paul is always in great demand. So we're thrilled to have him with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big stern welcome to Paul Krugman. Paul, welcome to Stern, and thank you for coming to join us.
Thanks. It was a long and arduous trip, all 25 blocks of it.
Now, no economist in the world has as many responses to their tweets or to their column in the New York Times as you do. What is the objective of your column, and who do you think of as the audience?
Yeah, the objective, most of the time, is just to nudge the way people think about an issue a little bit. You know, you're not making policy. I'm not sitting, at the helm of policy the way you did. So you're never in a position to actually have a clear, decisive impact on anything. But maybe you can change the tone of discussion. Maybe you can bring in ideas. Maybe you can bring down ideas when there are really bad ones that are prevalent. And it's informing and influencing a smart audience. And it's always a little bit hard to know whether you've actually accomplished anything, but once in a while I see that some turn of phrase or something I've introduced becomes common currency, and the best is when it's not attributed to me. Yeah. When you see something that you've put into the circulation and you know it came from you, but it just becomes something that people say.
What kind of things do the readers say when they respond? Okay. Do you get lots of emails and tweets back?
I never look at my Twitter replies. Because that's a cesspool, and we know that.
Right.
I never, I do, not always, but I will look at comments. But you get there's a lot of people who are enormously heartened, or they say, you said what, or you've clarified things. Then there's a lot of. Actually, one of the good things about Twitter is that a lot of the hate email, I think, has moved into the Twitter responses, which are easier to ignore. So it's very people get worked up both ways, and it is funny. I mean, if I might say, what's interesting is that the biggest troves of hate mail, hate responses come not when I write about politics, but when I write about monetary policy. So there's nothing like saying that the central bank should print more money for getting hundreds of outraged emails from people accusing you of confiscating their hard-earned income.
These are not from central bankers. These are from ordinary people.
That's right. So it's that certainly people are paying attention. At the Times, there's no platform quite like it in the world. And
how do you decide what to write on each week?
So there are, most of the time it's about something terrible that's happening. Let's be honest about the state of the world right now. And then it's a little bit what seems bubbling up. But actually, at the moment, I actually do a fair bit of deliberate counter-programming. So everybody is writing about Kavanaugh. And I'm saying, okay, what can I write about that's salient? And these are politically charged times, but it's not about. And also sometimes, what do I know something about? But I'm paying attention to events. I do follow about 30 people on Twitter myself, so I'm following the news cycle, which these days the news cycle is about 33 minutes long. And
if that.
So it's actually one important thing, actually, given the worlds that I've straddled. Is I will write something quite often when someone I respect asks me to write about it. So so someone will say, you've got to weigh in on the wrongness of this this latest healthcare proposal, or you need to make the case for a genuine infrastructure program or something like that. And I find that that's often a good guide. If smart people who are policy engaged think it's important to have my voice in there, I'll lend it.
Right. Let me take you now to away from the New York Times and the wider audience and to the economics profession. You gave a talk very recently, 10 days or 2 weeks ago, and you said the following, and I quote here: "Few economists have done what they should, which is to question the whole direction macroeconomics has gone these past 4 decades or so." And then you went on to say, "But nevertheless," and I quote again, "the past decade has been a huge validation for textbook macroeconomics." What did you mean by that?
Okay, let's start with the second part first. So textbook macroeconomics, the stuff that's actually in the textbooks, including mine, but the stuff that we teach is still, for the most part, relatively old stuff. It's we teach ISLM. We teach very simple models of where there's money, bonds, and goods, and don't get too fancy. And that approach, in normal times, it's hard to know whether it's telling you anything very different than you might be saying otherwise. But in the crisis, one of the things about that approach is it told you that the rules change when you're in a deeply depressed economy with interest rates close to zero, that things will not at all work the way they work in other times, that you can have huge increases in the monetary base, a huge expansion in basically, loosely speaking, print vast amounts of money and it will not be inflationary, contrary to what people expect, that you can have big budget deficits and they won't drive up interest rates, that the adverse effects of cuts in government spending will be much larger than in normal times. And those were extremely controversial propositions. If you go back to 2008, 2009, a lot of people, I still get occasional mail from people who say, I'm really, or conversations, people say, I'm really puzzled. All the experts said that there was going to be lots of inflation. And I say, well, you weren't listening to the right experts. You were probably watching CNBC. But the sort of basic textbook simple approach came through with flying colors. Mm-hmm. Things worked pretty much the way they would. I mean, in fact, even the numbers. We thought the multiplier before. We thought the multiplier might be around 1.5 under those conditions, and now we have a whole lot of evidence, and it looks like it's around 1.5. So, but the whole thing worked. But all of the stuff. It's been more or less impossible to publish a paper doing these things in a journal for 40 years. To publish something in a journal, it had to be highly mathematicized. It had to be derived from microeconomic first principles. And all of that proved useless or worse because it turned out that a fair number of reasonably influential economists had forgotten or never learned the very basic stuff. And so they started. They actually acted to oppose the things that needed to be done in the crisis. So that's what I meant. That what was in the journals was no help, but what was in the textbooks and has been in the textbooks for about 40 years or more actually worked quite well.
Why do you think it was that the sort of leaders in the macroeconomics profession took us off down a path which turned out to be, I agree with you, very unhelpful in terms of understanding the world.
So I don't know how, DSGE has turned out to be absolutely no help, dynamics, anyway, whatever. But, I think it's actually, the dark version would be, the extreme income inequality promoted bad, but I don't think that's actually the case here. I'm a big cynic, but I don't think that particular part worked that way. I think it was more problems of the sociology of the profession. What you want to do as an up-and-coming economist is prove that you're smart, and doing hard math and difficult problems and arguing from first principles, which may not be true but are rigorous, is a good way to show that you're smart. Whereas being sensible and is less so, and kind of got this stranglehold of if it doesn't have a lot of intertemporal optimization, blah blah blah, then it isn't the real stuff. And the way out is probably to be more empirical. So there's been a renaissance of good empirical work in macro. in the past decade, but it's still. It's really. I mean, in this case, I may just be too close to it, but I see how hard it is for smart but sensible young people to deal with an environment where proving that you're smart requires doing stuff that's technically difficult, even though it may not be sensible at all.
Do you think this is because people somehow went off on a path where instead of realizing that the behavior of the system or the economy as a whole was not well described by aggregating the behavior of a large number of individuals?
No, I think it's actually a failure to think realistically about the behavior of individuals. I mean, that's it's remarkable how rarely we in economics actually talk to people who make economic decisions, business decisions, about why do you do what you do.
So I'm very struck that behavioral economics is all about artificial experiments, largely with students.
Right. We had an event. I do. People don't know. I do the same sort of thing that Mervyn does for my institution, which is bring people in to do talks. But this wasn't me actually. But we'd have a lot of talks. We had an ethnographer talking about the working class, and just last week, and I was just blown away by. Even just by the notion of going out and talking to a bunch of people in depth about how, and there's a little, just a tiny amount of that in economics, and the few bits we have, Truman Bewley on why wages don't fall in recessions, is incredibly enlightening. But we just never do that. It's very hard to. The profession has not rewarded that kind of work.
Now, back in 2016, you were pretty negative about the outlook for the U.S. economy under President Trump. How do you explain what's happened since?
I made a bad call on election night, which I retracted 3 days later. And I did exactly what I tell people not to do. I apologized for it, which is to let your political sentiments color your economic judgment. I was horrified at the outcome of the election. I am no less horrified now, but but projecting that something you think is a bad thing is going to cause short-term business cycle movements is never, I let myself be swayed, and it didn't come out of a model. It was more of a gut reaction, and that's not a good way to do. So that was a classic kind of mistake. The only thing I can say is I did retract after 3 days, and I did say I was wrong and try to understand why I was wrong. It's really bad to let your political views color your economic judgment and then just stick with it year after year, which all too often people do.
I mean, I was watching the election night coverage, and we were all being told that the forward market implied that the stock market was actually going to fall very sharply.
No, that's right, and but everyone was completely flummoxed, which we really shouldn't have been, because but it was. Nate Silver said there was a 30% chance of what happened happening, right. And but there was a kind of a panic reaction. I feel particularly bad about my own thing, because I had criticized other people in advance for predicting that Brexit would lead to an immediate recession, because I said you were letting your, I think it's a bad idea too, but I don't think that it's going to work that way. Yep. And then I did exactly what I had criticized in other people. So, hey, I'm human.
So moving on, President Trump has now imposed tariffs on a wide range of goods. How worried should we be? Is this just a threat that's going to go away, or should we be really concerned about this?
Okay, and so there's two questions. One is where the trade tariff policy will actually go, or three questions actually. I'll turn into a Monty Python routine any minute now. Amongst the questions, first is where trade policy is going to go, and that is actually, in some ways, the hardest part, because it's so driven by, as far as we can tell, whims, and it's not there aren't clearly defined objectives. It's not quite clear what they're going to want. I mean, I was predicting or expecting all kinds of stuff. The last thing I expected was that we might be able to essentially leave NAFTA intact with regard to Mexico and get into a bitter trade war with Canada. You know, who would have thought that was coming? So it's very hard to know where it's going. I think it will be, however, I think at the moment the best bet is that something will be worked out with Canada in the end, just because business needs it so badly. But it's hard to see a resolution to the stuff with China, so this is significant. Second question is how much economic damage it does. And there, if we take our own models seriously, which you always want to do unless you have really good reason not to, they say that even though we're talking about tariffs on a lot of stuff and it could lead to some significant reduction in the amount of trade, the actual cost in GDP should still be in the order of a fraction of a percentage point, not more than that. Maybe some additional disruption in a way where we had this shock as Chinese exports soared into the U.S., which probably made us richer as a country, but did disrupt, it didn't make everybody richer, it disrupted people. Now we're doing it in reverse. And it's like the old joke about the motorist who runs over a pedestrian and says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, let me fix it," and backs up and runs over the pedestrian again. So there'd be some disruption from all this. In some ways, I think the worst thing, and this is why there are three, is that we've actually essentially, on trade as in other matters, abrogated rule of law. I mean, both the international system, the way it's set up, and U.S. law does give the U.S. president some discretion to impose tariffs in face of import surges, in the face of unfair practices for national security reasons. But what's happening now is that although the letter of the law has been obeyed, the actual use of the law has been clearly violation. It's all arbitrary. National security tariffs against Canada. Come on. So which means that the United States is no longer a reliable partner. U.S. agreements are not worth anything because U.S. trade policy is subject to the whims of the president. As always, when the U.S. does something, retaliation is one thing, but emulation is another thing. If the U.S. doesn't care about the rules, who else will? So I think that in some ways the damage to the process is more important than the immediate economic damage.
Could this go further than merely the trade field?
Of course. I mean, national security. I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, there's an element of crony capitalism already in the way the tariff policy is being made, because a lot of the tariffs are on inputs. That was interesting. I get very lightly edited, but I just used inputs in the column, and my copy editor said, "People don't know what that means." So I had to explain in context what. But it's on stuff like steel and parts. But the things on steel, there have been exemptions granted. Some firms have been allowed to import steel tariff-free, and the process by which those decisions are made is not at all transparent, and it does seem to involve political connections. It's very third-worldly already. And you could imagine that kind of crony capitalism could spread well beyond the trade field, in which case it becomes a very big deal for the U.S. economy.
So as an outsider, my impression is that the U.S. Constitution and legal system are there precisely to prevent that sort of selective application of regulations or laws to individual firms.
Yeah.
How far is that under pressure?
Oh, very much so. I mean, it's, again, we have the, specific firms that have political connections to the administration have been granted exemption. Now, it's always been the system is only as good as the willingness of other branches of government to enforce it. The Commerce Department, if a Commerce Secretary who starts granting by executive fiat favors to his friends, that may be clearly in violation of the law, but who's going to, how many tanks does the business community have? Congress needs to intervene and say you can't do that. And if you have a Congress that is not going to do that, then who cares what the law says?
Now, turning to at home, it seems that whether this is right or not, you might comment on that. The rising inequality of incomes has been greater in the last 25 years than it has been in some other industrialized countries. Is that true? And is that because free markets have been given too much rein?
Yeah. Yes, the U.S. has, I mean, income inequality has risen a little bit in almost all advanced countries, but it's risen much more in the U.S. and to a lesser extent the U.K. Than in the rest. And now part of that, at the top end, there may be a little bit of a compositional effect because it's not an accident that very high incomes have risen most in the two countries that have the biggest, that are global financial centers. So, but even beyond that, there's quite a lot. There's something special. I think it's both. It seems to be both changes in labor market institutions. The lowest inequality in the advanced world is Denmark, and the highest is us. We basically destroyed the union movement. Denmark still has a labor force that is 2/3 unionized. That's going to make a big difference on the distribution of market incomes. We do a lot less redistribution than other advanced countries do. So the combination of, it's essentially political, I would say. When all is said and done, it's basically the rightward tilt of politics and policy has been greater in the U.S. than anywhere else, and that is why we've had a bigger increase in inequality than anyone else.
And what would you do about it if you were to be setting policy today?
Well, I mean, I think it's a grab bag of things, although there are a couple of big ones we can think about. One of them is to the extent that we probably can, in fact, influence the jargon, predistribution and redistribution. We can do something on predistribution. We can influence the market distribution of incomes by things like raising the minimum wage, making it easier to do union organizing and harder for companies to bust their unions, just generally enhance workers' bargaining power. How much of that would roll back the rise in inequality that we've seen? How far would it go? Nobody knows, but it's worth trying. We can do more. I mean, U.S. aid to low-income families is way below what other countries do, and we could do quite a lot more. And we could seriously lock in guaranteed health care for everybody. That's a pretty big deal. Now the thing is, Obama did more to reduce inequality than people realize. Tax rates at the top end went up substantially. A lot of aid through Obamacare went to lower income and lower end of the working class families. So, but do that, but 3 or 4 times over, and then also do stuff to make it easier for labor to have more bargaining power, and we might. Nobody knows how. Will it bring us back to the middle class society I grew up in? Nobody knows, but it's worth trying.
So again, looking at it from the outside, I'm struck that much of the restructuring of American industry, the complaints that manufacturing is in decline, are similar to what Europe experienced in the 70s and 80s. But it was easier in Europe to cope with it, partly because of the social the framework for support, but particularly also because the geographical distance between communities was small. So you don't get in Europe the phenomenon which you can see here sometimes, or whole communities or towns deserted. Some of the New England mill towns, you just don't see that in Europe because people are close to each other.
Well, I would say that, but devastated former industrial areas, those exist. I mean, I was recently in Bradford, in England, and to say that don't look too good.
Well, it doesn't look good, but it hasn't been abandoned.
Right. Well, but in some ways, our problem though is in fact, or arguably, the problem is that people won't abandon places. There are we have a whole. Certainly, the places where the social ills are worst in the U.S. now, the places where we've had this, where Ann Case and Angus Deaton are telling us we have a surge in deaths of despair, are places where the old industries have collapsed, but people don't leave. And so it's not entirely clear that that lack of geographic mobility is a good thing here.
Do you think the deaths of despair are related to this economic decline?
Oh, very much so. I mean, they're clearly peaking in Appalachia and former coal country and places where old industries have gone away. And it's a real problem because in some ways geographic mobility in the U.S. seems to have gone down. People are being stranded there. So the abandoned mill town is not sure that's. I mean, the mill town that industry has abandoned, but the people are still there, can actually be worse. And we have a fair bit of that too.
Now, President Trump is an unusual president.
We could say that, yeah.
Do you think that he has managed over the last 2 years or so to retain the support of his supporters? And more importantly, do you think that members of what sometimes and probably properly called the elite, which economists very much part of in many ways, have just lost touch with what ordinary people's lives are like? You spoke earlier of the fact that economists don't actually go and look very much or talk to people very much.
Here's where, first of all, I guess we'll find out. We'll get some barometer in November to see where things are. I mean, right now, it looks probable that the Democrats will take the House, and they have a shot at the Senate despite a very adverse map. And if that happens, it's worth remembering that Trump did lose the popular vote, so it's not all clear. And look, while I think we certainly were not sensitive enough, aware enough of the hurt people were feeling, there have been a lot now of pretty serious political science studies. And I'm a big, I'm not one of the problems our profession has is the imperial sense that we know better than anybody. But in fact, political scientists are actually smart people working in a fundamentally harder field than ours. And the overwhelming conclusion of the political science retrospectives is that economic anxiety, all of that, was not a very important determinant of that election, and that racial antagonism was central. So the core Trump supporters are not especially poorer than people who voted for Clinton. What they are is a lot more negative on people who are a different color. And
so you don't think the deaths of despair played a role in
some of it, and it may be that the particular geographic concentration of votes, the reason that Midwestern states flipped, by narrow margins, despite a national popular vote going the other way, has something to do with the depression of those regions, but not clear. And but to the extent that is there, then there's a. Let me say something. One thing that I kind of expected wrongly, and also, to be honest, somewhat feared, was that Trump would actually be at least a little bit the populist he claimed to be. That he would actually do something for the people who voted for him, the people in depressed industrial areas. And in fact, he's followed, except for the trade policy, he's followed a straight orthodox Republican agenda with nothing at all, not a crumb. And I think last year, the attempt to repeal Obamacare drove home to at least a few people, hey, you know something, I'm depending upon these programs that they want to cut.
When did you first decide to become an economist?
Okay. I have a cute story, which is mostly true, and then a bit more.
I bet you could tell us which bits are true and which aren't.
The cute story is I was a nerdy teenager who read science fiction, and I read in particular Isaac Asimov's Foundation novels.
This is on Long Island.
Yes, and in the Foundation novels, the galactic empire is collapsing, but there are these mathematical social scientists who have a way to avoid the dark age that will follow. And I wanted to be one of those guys, so economics was as close as I could get. And then that certainly led me to think I wanted to take some social science courses, and then I just had the huge good luck, as often happens, of finding the right mentor. So I was I took a course from Bill Nordhaus at Yale, became his research assistant on work on energy, and just it turned out this was something I really liked doing, and at least he and other people thought I was pretty good at doing, and that was,
And then
the path.
graduate school. And so on.
In those days, MIT was the place to go, and
Yep.
so I went to MIT.
Where were you when you heard that you'd won the Nobel Prize? And were you surprised?
Okay. All right. So I was actually in D.C. I was down there for the Group of 30s International Banking Seminar.
Right.
And my cell phone rang at 6:30 in the morning in my hotel room. And my first thought, by the way, was that's an obviously fake Swedish accent. So I didn't really believe it until half an hour later when it showed up on the website. My name had been out there. And in fact, there'd been some Thomson Reuters, I guess, I don't know if they still do, but they used to make predictions. And they had predicted me for 2004, which didn't happen. And so I actually just put it out of my mind. Because I do know people who, they're waiting every
year.
That corrodes you from the inside out. So I had made a point of it not even knowing what day it was going to. I paid no attention thereafter. So it came as a surprise in the sense that I wasn't at all hanging on it. I wasn't even aware that that was the day. It did not. It wasn't like this is impossible. This can't be happening. Although, as I said, my first reaction was that it was a prank.
Right. Did it change your life?
Yeah. Although less probably than most, right? A lot of people who have been plowing their academic pastures for a long time are suddenly out there, and of course I was already writing columns for the New York Times, right? So it didn't mean that, but what it did actually, it's almost like the reverse. Most people who knew me for the public. As a column writer for the public persona, just being the way things are, and had no idea that I had this, that I was a serious academic. So all of a sudden I acquired this, it's kind of weird to be, who really cares what some Swedes think, but suddenly I had this easy credential that actually opened up a lot of doors and made it a lot easier to get, and I'd always been doing a lot of travel and speaking and so on, but the fees got higher.
How much higher? From nothing to big, I take it.
No, it wasn't nothing. It's
small to large, would you say?
No, from medium to large.
Medium to large. Splendid. Now, I think the most important question I want to ask you, I've been wanting to ask you this for a long, long time. When did you discover Arcade Fire?
Oh.
And why do you think it's such a good band?
Okay. This was one of these being open to. I went to, when they won the Grammy in 2010. And for some reason I thought, I wonder what that's about, because it was a surprise. Did get some headlines. And, I'm a baby boomer. General view was that nothing good had been produced since the 70s. And so I wonder, and it was, I started to listen to it, and I said, hey, this is really good. And then I opened up to, so now now I'm a 65-year-old wannabe hipster. I go to concerts at Bowery Ballroom. It's just because it's so great that there's vital new music being produced now.
And you've done panel events with the...
I did. I was on a panel at South by Southwest with on the economics of creativity with the Butler brothers from Arcade Fire and a bunch of other people. It was, it's really pretty. If there's one thing of being a bit of a public personage, it is that it sometimes gets you into rooms that you wouldn't have expected to be in, gets you to meet people you wouldn't have expected to meet. So I try to take advantage of that whenever I can.
Wonderful. I think now is the time when we should give the audience a chance to ask questions. Now, we have microphones that will move up and down the aisles. If you could just state who you are, please do not give a speech, but a very short, punchy question. And then most important of all, hand the microphone back along the row to the person from whom it came. So who would like to ask a question here? So there's one here in the middle.
Thanks. My name is Michael Liebert. So much of your column seems to be when you're, it doesn't seem to be a contest of ideas between the left and the right. Much of the space that you use is to describe how fraudulent and empty the right's ideas are, or at least today. Are there any economists on the right that you, even though they may not be employed by the administration, that you would find an intellectual challenge to debate, that they have ideas of substance?
Okay, I do. In fact, I even do these debates some, trying to think about. I mean, there's certainly there are a number of longtime Republican economists who are very good economists and have done great, fine work. So, I actually I worked for Marty Feldstein. I worked for him in Washington on the staff, not just sub-political level at the Council of Economic Advisors in 1982, 83. So it's Reagan administration. And they was shocked by that. I was a senior international economist. The senior domestic economist was his name? Larry Summers. Don't know what happened to him. So
He was a graduate student around those times.
No, he's exactly my age, and we're. But currently, not so much. Current work. I mean, Ed Glazer, who mostly does regional economics, urban economics, and I think he still considers himself a Republican, but I think his stuff is great. I find it really interesting. He actually just did this thing on regional inequality with Larry. So that's an example. It's not all, but the fact of the matter is that the people, the serious Democratic-leaning economists actually are listened to by Democratic politicians. The serious Republican-leaning economists are not. You have people, really essentially entertainers from CNBC are to the extent there are alleged economists in this administration, that's who they've got.
Question over here. One row back. Lady in black,
Sure.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name's Emil Shahada. I'm one of the faculty members here at Stern. And I was just curious, you mentioned your objective in the New York Times column is to nudge and maybe try and influence. But I always wonder, if you're kind of preaching to the choir, since many of us who read already agree with your ideology, and if you ever thought that having an outlet with people who, Breitbart News, or somebody who has completely radically different views, if you would have more impact and achieve that objective in nudging a different audience, a different demographic.
Okay, I don't think so. Partly because that's just not the way political discourse works in America right now, and by the way, those outlets wouldn't publish me, right? But also, no. So it's more. There is a partly it's a question of actually taking people who probably share values with me, but about where they should be going, and. In some cases, so look, I think there was a period which I still think of as having been very productive in my life and productive for America, which was back. Some of you may remember in 2005, George W. Bush tried to radically essentially to privatize Social Security, and I was very heavily in the business of arguing that this was a really bad idea, and that the arguments the administration were making were not good ones, which may or may not have contributed to the failure of that effort. But then the question became among liberals, okay, well, that's what we're against. What are we for? And the answer became health care. And then the question was making the case that should be a priority for the center left in America, that it was okay to have an imperfect system, that it didn't have to, you might prefer to have single payer Medicare for all, but that it was okay to get something that was more conservative, both in the sense of actually adopting some conservative ideas, but also in the sense of requiring less change on the part of the way people get their health care. So that process of pushing for health care, which culminated during the 2008 primaries, it became, if you wanted to be a serious contender for the Democratic nomination, you had to be for universal health care. And then when Obama came into office, there was a ready-made template which had been put together by bunches of, lots of wonks and so on, but I think I was part of creating the climate for that effort. And that's the kind of thing that you can try to do. So it's not, if you think that you're going to take someone who reads Breitbart or watches Fox for their news and that I'm going to persuade them, I wish I lived in that universe, but I don't. But in this one, it's a much more moderate thing, and it does involve, it's a little bit of preaching to the choir, but maybe giving some advice to the choir as well.
So we have a question here at the front and then one at the back later.
Thank you. My name is Inigo Petrian. I'm a MBA 1 student here at Stern. You touched briefly on Brexit. Yeah. So I would like to understand what you think, because I don't think anybody knows what hard Brexit means, what soft Brexit means, and also, let's say, how does it impact the idea or the project of the European Union? Thank you.
Oh, boy. I think people, thank you, but I don't think people want too much of that. But,
we haven't got more than 24 hours.
That's right.
And
by the way, since Theresa May's government hasn't seemed to be able to figure out what hard Brexit's on. No, I mean, there are different. One thing you could do is to say we're no longer a member of the European Union, but keep most of the arrangements pretty much the way they are. That would be soft Brexit. Hard Brexit would be that it would be reduced to something more like maybe a customs union, but without a lot of the other stuff, or just plain bomb out of it and just become drop into a WTO rules. I will say this. I thought it was a really bad idea to drop out of the EU, and I think Britain will pay a significant price. And it'll be less trade policy per se than the frictions that come from no longer being part of the EU. It'll just make transactions more. And a good estimate of the cost is that it'll make Britain 2% poorer, but that's sort of within a range from 0.5 to 8, because it's hard. It's particularly, we don't know what the effect will be on the City of London. But I would say that the trouble is the European project was in big trouble already. Brexit is just one more blow, but the EU blew a lot of credibility through bad policies in response to the financial crisis. The euro was a very ill-conceived idea and has exacted an enormous cost. And the EU has proved incapable, stepping out of the role of economics, of dealing with fundamental threats to its philosophy. I mean, the fact that they're only now talking about sanctions against the Hungarian government. You destroyed democracy years ago there, and only now is the EU tentatively saying maybe we should do something about those people. So Brexit, and in some ways that's a consequence. I mean, there is a kind of arrogance and unreachability in Brussels that certainly contributed, which is not to say that the Brexiteers, there's some pretty terrible people there too. They're actually probably worse, but I think the European project, which has been one of the great achievements of, since World War II, but it was in deep trouble years before Brexit came online.
Question at the back here.
Question or a comment, not a speech, and a question. As we've gone from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy to a technology economy, the returns to kind of labor versus capital and the 30% of people who have graduate degree, undergraduate college degrees has changed things, maybe exacerbated some things. But I'm curious, your colleague, Mr. Blinder, talked about the lamppost theory in his recent book, Alan Blinder. My question is this: income inequality, the myth of inequality. There was an article in the paper saying that basically 10% of the population gets 33% of income and 47% of taxes. They did show also that in the OECD, if you take a look at it and you actually calculate the transfer payments back from the United States, $1.6 trillion a year go to 80% of the people. So I'm not sure. Can you help me understand exactly how income inequality works now?
I'm not even sure I know how to. I didn't quite get where all of that was going. But I mean, come on. The after-tax income is still highly unequally distributed, after tax and transfer. Less so. We do reduce income inequality a bit through the tax and transfer system, but it's but not enough to stop it. And anyone who denies that there has been a radical, that we have very high levels of inequality in America, and that those levels have increased a lot. Walk around this city. Open your eyes. I mean, the statistics are important, but anyone who tries to claim that the numbers are somehow deeply misleading has to be denying the evidence of your own eyes. This is just not the society. Okay. Anyway.
There's one in the middle at the back there, I think. There, sorry, yes, sir. Okay, and then afterwards at the back row, and then there were some others over here.
Hi, I'm Josh Futterman, 2000 MBA and founder and CEO of ParkU, a startup here in New York. My question for you is about the TPP and what you think the impact is going to be of our withdrawal in our long-term involvement in Asia.
Okay, so TPP was, I was actually a soft opponent, although very soft, partly because I just felt it was spending political capital that we didn't have, and which I think, given what happened in the 2016 election, looks like I was right to be worried about political capital, partly because it wasn't really a trade agreement. TPP was really about intellectual property and dispute settlement, and in both cases it wasn't at all clear that the things that we were proposing to do were actually welfare enhancing for the world as a whole. Stronger intellectual property protection is not an unambiguously good thing, and making the dispute settlement procedure more business friendly is not an unambiguously good thing. So I didn't think it was a great deal, but what is true is that the U.S., by simply dropping out of negotiations, we've sort of just stepped off the stage. Now, I think other things are more important. I think that our exit from TPP is actually less important than the fact that we're abusing existing trade law, the fact that we are indiscriminately using national security justifications for tariffs, or that we're doing a Section 301, against China without any specific enumeration of what it is that we say they're doing wrong. Just they're bad guys. I think that's much more important. But altogether, we are blowing our credibility, and sure, Asian countries will, the rest of the world in general will make arrangements that bypass us.
Gentleman on the back row.
Thanks for speaking here. I'm Michael Spitzer-Rubinstein. I'm an MBA 1 here at Stern. And following up on that and several of your earlier comments, what do you see as the future of the sort of global free trade project? And as people who aren't in government but may have some level of influence and may have more in the future, what should we be doing and focusing on?
Oh, wow. I think the era of big trade agreements is probably over. In fact, it was probably over. It actually has been over. The last serious effort at a big international agreement was 17 years ago, right? And was Doha, and that was a Hail Mary pass. It didn't look likely to work even then. But mostly that's because because trade was already very free, and any future forward movement was going to involve dealing with awkward stuff, the really awkward stuff, or just or things that weren't really about trade, like TPP. And the question mostly now is one about maintaining this relative openness. And I don't. So far, the trading, the amount of protectionism we got during the Great Recession was far less than a lot of people feared. A lot of people thought it was going to be the 30s all over again, and that just didn't happen. And that may be structural. Maybe the same reason why we're actually, even now, even with all that Trump is doing, we're not seeing all that much. It is these global supply chains. It's a much more, business is, is integrated, certainly within regions, but even internationally, and there's a lot of producer side interests who don't want to see the flow of components from abroad disrupted. But where it ends up, I think we're kind of at a loss. One thing that is interesting, though, is to say that for the polling suggests, you might have thought that the protectionism would be an easy sell. That because you can say, well, we're going to tax the foreigners, it's going to hurt them and not us, and it's been unfair. All the things Trump does say. But in fact, it's looking like the tariffs that he's imposed are a serious political liability. People really, it's hard to find any large group. I said that in today's paper yesterday. What day is today anyway? But it's hard. Yes, today's paper. It's hard to find any large group that actually supports the tariffs. And you can find significant groups that really hate them. So I'm not sure that a breakdown of global trade is actually on the horizon. It doesn't look like a winning political strategy, which doesn't mean that it can't happen anyway. But it doesn't look like it's a way to win elections.
I want to take a question from the right-hand side here. There's a gentleman here. Right.
Hi, my name is Sam Jernigan. I'm a macro trader. Question for both of you on the global imbalances. You've both written about this in the past, specifically Lord King's Sudoku speech, where you said, will the financial crisis 2009 be known for financial crisis or not responding to the global imbalances? And do you see the rise of protectionism and Trump an end result of that? And then specifically for Professor Krugman, your 99 Thinking About the Liquidity Trap speech, or rather paper. And you talked about that a central bank would not be able to buy enough foreign currency to close the output gap. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about Switzerland, the situation they're in with the size of their balance sheet. How could that ever be unwound? And just any thoughts around that?
So I think people are here to hear Paul. So let's let Paul respond.
No, I mean, easy. I'm trying to avoid the temptation to really dive into the weeds here. But currency intervention is conceptually, it's in the same basket as quantitative easing. It's buying unconventional assets instead of just buying. We found once interest rates hit zero, buying short-term government liabilities, which is what central bankers normally do, runs out of room. So you try to move stuff by doing large purchases of other stuff, and it's arguable. I mean, Switzerland seemed for a while to be able to hold down the franc by saying we'll buy unlimited amounts at a certain level, but you do end up with them holding an enormous currency reserve without it seeming to be too effective. And there's a debate we're not going to have tonight about whether there was what evidence do we really have that any of these unconventional purchases did very much. But if your view is that they didn't do very much, then your view should also be that unwinding them won't do very much. So not really not a big problem. So I guess I have just not found global imbalances to be in general they just people keep on thinking that there have to be the source of crisis, but it's not clear that they have been at all. A very specific, the euro crisis was in large part really a balance of payments crisis, but that's the reason it could become that kind of crisis was the fact of a shared currency. And but the other stuff, I mean, good old-fashioned, kind of grateful to the Turks for having a good old-fashioned leverage foreign debt currency crisis now, just to remind me of the old days. But it's not what's going to happen to the U.S. We have lots of problems, but that's not one of them.
Now, some question. Yes, gentleman in the middle.
Hi, my name is Mark, Economics 07. I wanted to ask about Venezuela, which is a total disaster right now. And if so a group of leaders came into Venezuela and had good intentions and wanted to turn something around, what would they even do at the moment?
Boy, I'm not sure I know what the starting point is in Venezuela, but it's not. Venezuela is a very conventional crisis. Relying on the printing press to pay the government's bills, hyperinflation, trying to stop the hyperinflation with price controls causing shortages. It's a very old-fashioned thing, and the standard answer is have a credible set of policies that will control the fiscal situation. The stability itself the perception of stability brings a lot back. This story has been told many times. The only thing I'll say is that Venezuela has been really badly governed as far back as I can remember. It's something about the curse of petroleum or something like that. And it's a class. The reason they have the government they have now is that the previous regimes, which were dominated by the elite, were also miserable economic managers. They're not this bad, but extremely, did nothing for the poor. And Chavez came in there because he, at least initially, did do something. Now it's turning into a huge disaster. But gosh, and when I was in Washington in 1982-83, that was the first Latin American debt crisis, and there were serious. Mexico, Brazil, even Argentina were seriously struggling to deal with their problems. Everybody hated Venezuela because Venezuela had managed to get into a foreign debt crisis while consistently running trade surpluses. It was all money that went into Venezuela and then made its way out into bank accounts of wealthy Venezuelans overseas, and so there was no sympathy. The Venezuelans were even then perceived as so. I think the economic measures wouldn't be hard to describe. The question is the political environment there just so poisoned? Who can step in and become a credible stabilizer there? And let me say, since it is being whispered, a U.S. military intervention is not the answer.
So this is changing the old maxim that was used back in the days you were in Washington of it's the economy stupid, it's the politics stupid.
Oh, I'm very much certainly something like the Venezuelan story is a politics, but in general, a lot of the things we see are politics first. I mean, if you want to understand the rise of inequality, there's a lot of reason to believe that politics was the leading edge of the change, and that's true, I think, of a lot of other things as well. I just think in general to deny the influence of politics on the current. The idea that the invisible hand of the marketplace is driving events and there's nothing you can do.
Right.
Not so.
We got time for one more question. Gentleman over there. Yep, it's you, sir.
Hi, I'm Steve Figuski, professor of finance here. Hello, Paul.
Hi.
This is a question having to do with trade. I was delighted, by the way, that you had a strong word in favor of Keynesian macroeconomics. I thought that was very nice to hear. On the trade side, another thing that we all learned in the textbooks was that free trade is good. It can be Pareto optimal, but once we see that the benefits of free trade are not evenly distributed, then people are unhappy. But our rule is that there's enough benefits that if you distributed them properly, everybody should be in favor. we don't seem to be able to do that, to distribute the benefits from globalization to everybody. Are there countries that have done better at it than we have? And do you have ideas about what we might do to equalize the benefits of free trade?
Yeah. I would just say that schemes to specifically compensate the losers from trade have not historically been much of a success. We've had trade adjustment assistance. It's always been ineffective and trivial in the scheme of things. Countries that have strong social safety nets do seem to cope with the effects of any kind of shock, including trade, better. So, Denmark is just as open to the winds of global competition as the U.S. is, but doesn't have anything like our belt of rising mortality and zones where you have rising deaths of despair. So just a strong safety net helps. Now, all that said, even countries that have coped with the economic fallout of changes, technological, whatever, still have resentment. I mean, there are white nationalist parties in Denmark, in Sweden, in Finland. So there are more elemental forms of discontent that no economic policy can deal with. But if you ask about the ability to cope with change, just having a really, making sure that whatever else happens, it doesn't cost people their health care, that it doesn't mean that people starve. That's a big step towards coping with any of these things.
Paul, the hour is up. And
yeah.
Whatever discontent there may be in the world, there isn't any in this room. And can I just... Can I thank you on behalf of everyone for coming and sharing with us not just your insights, but also letting us see the person behind the Nobel Prize and the column. Paul, thank you very much.